James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
When he was barely 15 years old and still a high school student in his native Brooklyn, Aaron Copland declared his intention of becoming a composer. The declaration stuck. He not only became a composer, he became one of the most distinguished composers this country has produced. Most will associate his name with a period when he drew heavily upon American folkloric themes for such familiar pieces as Billy the Kid, Rodeo, and Appalachian Spring, the last of which, incidentally, won him a Pulitzer Prize. But Aaron Copland's work is not stuck in a single moment of time. It reflects the changes in the world and in the man over his more than 70 years. Though he has authored 2 books and has done some teaching, his occupation has been and remains a creator of music. Mr. Copland, in reading an autobiographical essay by you, I was just trying to recall something you said about quotations. You updated that autobiographical essay and pointed out that once something gets between quotation marks, somehow it's forever the truth, even though circumstances change. And I'm going to use some quotations. So if I go a bit far back, why, I hope you'll bring them up to date. I'm thinking, for example, of something you wrote, and I don't even recall when now, in saying that the aims of a that you said the objective of a composer is not necessarily to make beautiful sounds like Chopin and Mozart, much as one would like to do that, because one doesn't write the music of one's choice, but of necessity. What is the necessity? What is that necessity the composer must serve?
Well, one starts, after all, with themes or rhythms or harmonies that occur to you. That's the given part. You can't just start writing music out of nowhere, made up of nothing. It has to take a musical form, and it generally takes that form by ideas, musical ideas, which occur to you. Then after you begin working with them, you begin to have a sense of what the emotional background of that particular theme or rhythm or harmony may be. Some seem rather grandiose and powerful, others seem delicate and sensitive, others seem lively and sprightly, so that that's the given part. You can't take a sprightly theme and turn it into something else without falsifying it. Of course, you can develop it and find other elements in it, so that I would say pieces begin with that kind of material, which is a purely musical material, but which to the composer has an emotional significance.
What about the language in which you write it? I understand from this quotation that you would not write it in the musical language of the 19th or the 18th or the 17th century. You've got to write it in the language of your own time?
I would think so, yes. After all, that's the language which is natural to you. Why should I confine myself to the musical vocabulary of the 18th century when Wagner and many other composers have increased our vocabulary? And nowadays we use a vocabulary which is influenced by Schoenberg and Stravinsky and more recent composers than that.
But don't most of us listen with sort of what I might think of as 19th century ears?
Unfortunately, they do. Many people do.
But the composer's not writing for that, then?
They are not. No, that's part of the difficulty of the contemporary composer, to get the audiences to sort of, you know, realize what century they're living in and to lend their ears in a way that would be characteristic of people who live today. They can't hoped to have us write our music in the language of the past, although a great deal of the serious music they hear was written in the past.
Why can't you write in the language of the past?
It wouldn't be natural. Why should we limit ourselves? We have rhythms that Chopin never thought of. We have harmonies
It's a wider range of...
It's a wider range. We have a more complex language in one way, a more dissonant language which can express harsh feelings in a more effective way, I think. The language of music is really, you know, advanced with the times, and our listeners have to lend their ears in that way.
I want to ask you more about that later, but I want to turn time back for a moment, because I suppose you are not much thought of today as a rebel in music, but you were when you were young. In fact, you were a rebel when you came off the streets of Brooklyn, what you referred to as one of the drabbest streets in Brooklyn. And as I recall, you said something about the remarkable thing was that any music ever came out of that particular street.
That's true, yeah.
You came from a musical family, though, didn't you?
No, I wouldn't say that I came from a musical
Not
family.
really.
My sister played the piano and my brother played the violin. That means they were sufficiently musical to do that. But there are no composers or poets or dramatists that I know about in my family background, and it was a very large family, so that I felt a little bit like a freak when I decided I wanted to devote my life to the writing of serious music.
Do you know what prompted those thoughts?
Oh, no, not at all. It was just a natural inclination. I have no idea why it should have happened to me, but it did.
You took piano lessons from your elder sister, did you not?
In the beginning, yes. Then she said to me, well, I've taught you everything I know. You've got to get a real piano teacher now.
Where'd you go?
I went to a local man who taught in Brooklyn. He was a big shot because his studio really was in New York. And he only came to Brooklyn one day a week. That meant he was an important guy.
Did he in fact teach you, now looking back, did he teach you well?
Yes, he did. His name was Leopold Wolfson, and he had a studio on Clinton Avenue, I remember, and he was a good musician.
Then what went beyond that?
Well, then I started to get interested in composition. You see, I started composing short little piano pieces, and then gradually to realize that I needed a harmony teacher who would tell me about the secrets of harmony. And I found a teacher through Mr. Wolfson, who recommended a man called Reuben Goldmark, who was a teacher who lived in New York and whose uncle had been a famous composer in Austria and Hungary. His name was Karl Goldmark, and he'd written a famous opera, which is occasionally still done, called The Queen of Sheba. And he was a good man, but very academic from my standpoint. He knew about the rules of harmony, but if I tried to put anything over on him in the way of more modern harmonies that weren't in the books yet, why, he sort of reacted badly.
Was that just the rebelliousness of youth that prompted you to break out of the conventional patterns and harmonies?
No, it wasn't
and
the
so
rebelliousness of youth. I got to know music, which was in an advanced idiom. At that time, the name would have been Debussy and Ravel, and he didn't go that far. He was a man who dated from the late 19th century and still had the habits of the late 19th century.
But was patient enough with you, I suppose.
Yes, but he insisted on my doing the exercises I was supposed to do. I could do what I liked on the side, but for him, I had to obey the rules.
You after that went to Europe, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And
my interest in Debussy and Ravel, of course, made me want to go to the country they came from.
Is that why you chose France?
That's partly why, yes. A natural sympathy for French culture also. You see, the Germans were the villains toward the end of the teens, that is 1918.
Otherwise, that might have been a logical place to go, I suppose.
It was. For the generation before mine, everybody went to Leipzig and Berlin to study music. But my generation connected the more contemporary movement in music with France. And Stravinsky was there. And a lot of, for some reason or other, after the First World War, a lot of people gathered into Paris, so that it was an enormously lively 10-year period, as you know, from the 20s to the 30s.
Up to that point, you hadn't had too much association with other people interested in composing, I suppose, had you?
No, I didn't. I had one or two friends, fellow students with Mr. Goldmark, but otherwise I was rather on my own in Brooklyn.
Of course,
yes.
now one associates the name Aaron Copland so much with music that you're going to Paris to study seems not at all unusual. But to a boy off the streets of Brooklyn, so to speak, without over-dramatizing it, it must have been quite an experience to go to Paris alone, to Europe.
Well, it was. It was. I really got the courage to go partly because when I was thinking about it, I read about the foundation of a summer music school for Americans, which was being founded in the Palace of Fontainebleau. And I thought, gee, that's a good way of, you know, finding my way around by going to a place that's going to be full of American students, and yet in so characteristic a place as the Palace of Fontainebleau. Yes. Just imagine what it was like to go from Brooklyn straight to the Palace of Fontainebleau.
That's a cultural shock.
That sure was a cultural shock.
You studied there for a brief time, but it was another teacher there that I guess really was the important influence in those days, was it not?
Yes,
Monsieur Boulanger.
definitely, yes.
And
you know, it took a certain amount of courage. When I first heard about other students enthusing about Miss Boulanger, I thought, well, you know, a lady, nothing, she teaches harmony and counterpoint, but she wouldn't, of course, know about composition. So it took a certain amount of cogitating and hesitation about the idea of studying composition with a woman. Now, all the women's lib people are going to be shocked by that, but actually 50 years ago, and that's what we're talking about, there had not been any really outstanding women composers, no women Beethovens and Bachs, for some very extraordinary reason which nobody seems to understand, and which I feel pretty sure is going to change, or if it hasn't already changed. And so she really had to be very...
what was she?
Well, she had an extraordinary combination of talents, really. She was a very warm and human personality. There was nothing particularly teacherish about her. And she was living in the midst of French culture, not just musical culture, but culture. And she knew in the musical field all the bright young men, including Ravel and Roussel and a dozen other French composers of that time, who all seemed to be doing the new thing in music. So she was a kind of a conduit to what was going on as to the latest thing in music. And I remember she used to have Wednesday afternoon teas when you might find anybody there with their latest score. And I remember meeting Ravel there once. I even met Saint-Saëns there. Now, Saint-Saëns was born in 1834. Have you ever shaken hands with a man who was born in 1834? I did. I'm sorry to say he died 2 months later. But
you did feel that you were kind of plugged into a whole history then, and into a culture.
You were in touch with the liveliest movement in music of the period. Now that's a terrific thing for a young composer of 21 to get in touch with, because it just livens your whole spirit.
Was that carried on when you came back to New York after 3 years?
It was carried on in a different way. When I came back after having been in Paris for 3 years, I felt there was a lot to do in relation to the introducing of this newer music to the American musical public. Stravinsky in the early 20s was considered to be quite a wild man. The Sacre du Printemps was considered almost unplayable and very savage, full of rhythms that scared everybody. So that it was a question of introducing that newer kind of music, making it feel normal to listen to, and also another very preoccupying thing in my mind was, where were my fellow American composers with sympathies of the same as mine, with whom I could get together so we could sort of push our way into the conventional musical life?
You did get together with some of them through the League of Composers, didn't you? And then
yes, the League.
Ultimately, with the Copland sessions performances.
Yes, that's true. We found the League had been established in 1922 or 3, I guess 23, while I was still in Paris, so that by the time I got back, That was a big help, of course. But gradually we just wanted to have our own society, and with Roger Sessions I started these series called the Copland Sessions Concerts. It only lasted 3 years, but we did a certain amount of work that I think was valuable.
Why did you switch from that to the use of the jazz idiom then?
Well, it was the example of France in part, I think. We were very aware of the fact that the music in France, being written at that time, was not only new, but it was French in character, very different from Brahms and Reger, of a different quality, a different sensitivity, a different feel to it. And it was French because it reflected French characteristics, a certain refinement, a certain sensitivity. And we thought in order to write our own kind of serious American music, we had to reflect American characteristics. Now, what's more American than jazz? It was a feeling that through American rhythms of popular music, we could immediately have the advantage of using an idiom that would seem natural to us and perhaps sympathetic to our American
A means
listeners.
of reaching this audience for American composers then, in a sense.
Yes, exactly. And creating a music of our own, recognizably our own, you see.
But you didn't stay with that very long. You did two compositions?
Well, I would say that I stayed with it in the sense that any music I might have written in the years after might reflect jazz elements, and not so obviously as I used them in my piano concerto of 1927, or in my music for the theater of 1925.
But the influence is still there.
The influence of it's in the blood. Yes, I couldn't think rhythms without thinking in terms of what jazz has added to our musical language.
At some point, you became concerned about the relationship between the composer and the audience, and I understand that to mean that the audiences were not anxious to hear contemporary composers, weren't anxious to hear the music. And I suspect that it must be terribly frustrating for a composer not to be published, not to be performed, not to hear his own music performed, and much less to have audiences clamoring to hear it.
It's not only frustrating, it's an impossible situation to find yourself in. So that I felt that it was very natural that one would want to sort of do what one could to make contact with an audience. Obviously, if you're invited to write a score for a ballet with an American subject, you'd start thinking about American folk tunes of one kind or another. If it were a cowboy subject, you'd look up some cowboy tunes.
Hence Billy the Kid and Rodeo.
I think that would explain those pieces, yes. And in a similar way, the working with such theatrical media as ballet would make me want to occasionally write a piece based on American materials, which by definition would have a broader audience. I mean, a composer, when he writes his music, has a pretty good sense of who this is going to appeal to. If you write a very severe, dissonant piece for piano that lasts a half an hour, you know that by definition you're limiting the size of your audience. On the other hand, if you have it in you to write such a piece, you wouldn't dream of preventing yourself from doing so just because the audience is smaller. So that a composer generally knows the approximate kind of audience his music might appeal to. He's not fooling himself. And to deny yourself the pleasure either of writing for a very broad audience or for a limited audience seems to me to be foolish. You have to be realistic about it.
I suppose in some cases you're writing not for today's audience, but for tomorrow's audience, in the sense
Well, in every case, you hope you're writing for tomorrow's audience.
Yes, of course, that's right. But so many stories are told of the poor reception pieces had in their own time, and pieces that we not only accept, but of course love now. It's almost as though one has to write for the future. Is contemporary music reflective of today's environment, or is it kind of predictive of tomorrow's?
That would be a hard question to answer. Both, I would say. And it's difficult for us to decide now what 25 or 50 years from now is going to remain and be there just as strongly in the minds of those listeners at that time as it may be in our own minds. There's a certain gamble to being a creative artist. Nobody can guarantee you that in 100 years you're going to be remembered. I don't care how enthusiastic your present-day criticisms must be. So that in the end, the creator must have a sense inside himself that what he is doing is of real importance and therefore will have lasting value. But no one can guarantee it. It's a gamble.
But it's important.
It's the creator, it's very important.
Of course.
Yes.
I think of this question about the future or the present when I hear contemporary music performed, and I am told that if you hear it enough, you come to accept it.
That's the theory of it, anyhow.
That's the theory, of course. And I wonder, well, since it seems not to be in tune with my own perceptions of the moment, it's going to be in tune with someone else's perceptions 25 years from now or 50 years from now. Therefore, we must be moving in a direction where that kind of thing is going to have to be a natural part of our lives and our environment. And since it's staccato, since it's dissonant in many cases, angular, in some cases it seems almost to me to be spastic. It's
you put it rather ungratefully.
Yes, and I'm doing this obviously with the intention of provoking you somewhat.
Forethought,
yes, because I am curious to know what it will take to bring about a heightened appreciation of contemporary music, new music.
Well, one thing it will take is familiarity. You must be able to hear these things more than once. And more than 10 times would even be better if you lend yourself. What seems like a spastic rhythm now, 10 years from now, would seem like an exciting one, perhaps. It might remain spastic, of course. But things tend to, when they become familiar, to change their character in our minds. The proof of it is, of course, the rhythms of Stravinsky, which seems so unconventional at the time that he first wrote them in the 1918 period, and which seemed almost impossible for musicians, professional musicians, to play. Nowadays, you can hear a high school orchestra, almost, not every high school, but the best of the high school orchestras are able to handle rhythms that the New York Philharmonic couldn't handle in 1918 with any ease.
That means the skills of the musicians are improving constantly.
Definitely. I mean, the rhythm of 5/8 or 7/8 used to be a drama. They were used to playing 2 quarters and 3 quarters and 4 quarters, but no one had rarely seen a combination of quick-moving music which changed rhythms in every measure. That was really going too far, they said at the time. Now everybody can do it because they've become familiar. They've done it enough times so that it's the same as 2 quarter and 3 quarter.
This new music does offer a real challenge to the performer.
It does.
Often they look strained frequently as they perform it. It must take an intense concentration to...
It does, but that was true of every period. I'm sure the first performers of Wagner's operas thought it looked very strange.
And that's a satisfaction to the performer, I suppose, to have that kind of challenge thrown at him, isn't it?
If he's if he's a smart cookie, yes. If he's an old-fashioned stick in the mud, he'll just resent it. But the brighter boys and girls, they like to be challenged, and it's a triumph in their own minds when they succeed in mastering a new idiom with specific new musical problems.
It's interesting that while we're developing this new, highly challenging idiom, which does require attention, concentration, and a real depth of interest, we've also developed electronic mechanisms to feed music into our ears 24 hours a day, and where primitive man perhaps had to listen to stay alive, modern man almost has to non-listen, stop listen, unlisten. I don't know what the word is. This must affect the performance of music if we are being conditioned not to give our full attention. It would...
Yes, I regret that very much. I wish that when people are not in a mood to listen to music, that they would turn the darn thing off. Because that kind of casual bathing in musical sounds without listening to it, that's not at all the composer's idea. If you want to really listen to what he has to say, listen. Otherwise, forget it. You know, don't just let it on there as like wallpaper on a wall that just is around you because it makes a kind of pleasant sound.
When you did at one point in your life write functional music.
I might write functional music
You
tomorrow.
still write functional music?
I might, yes.
What is functional music as distinguished from the sort of thing we've been talking about?
Well, if you are a movie producer and director and you make a movie, you have to have music in certain parts of the film in order to help your film.
That's just a convention, though, I suppose, isn't it?
It is a convention, but sometimes it really is necessary, and it can heighten the emotional feeling of a particular film scene. That would be functional music in the sense that the music is serving a specific function to help the effectiveness of a different art. In the same way, I suppose, a ballet score is functional music, or any dramatic score that accompanies a spoken play at times.
It's that music that's not performed in the
functional.
concert hall, then simply for concert
so it
purposes.
serves that function in each case.
And here, I suppose, the challenge of the composer is somewhat different in that he has to serve the function in addition to serving his own creative impulses.
That's true, but it's a special satisfaction, actually. You see, I've written the music for 5 or 6 films, and I've had the experience of seeing a film scene played without any musical accompaniment, and then imagining what kind of music could heighten the effectiveness of that film, make it seem more tender, more touching, or more exciting, more frightening. And I've written such music and then heard it put to the film for the first time, and that's really quite an experience, because it does do things to a film scene. Sometimes it might be over-obvious. It might get in the way by being either too loud or in some way jar with the scene you're looking at. But you can make a sick boy seem much sicker, and you can emote with him much more tenderly if there's music going on. You might not be consciously aware of the fact that the music is going on, but it might play on your emotions.
So much the better
event.
if you're not aware, I suppose.
So much the better.
Yes.
If you're musical, you'll hear it. I mean, if you tend to listen to music, you'll hear
always
it,
be
whether you
there.
want to or
That's
not.
right. Mr. Copland, you said earlier that every composer wants to be remembered 100 years from now, and I suppose any composer like yourself would wish to be remembered for everything he has done. What would you most like to be remembered for among the works that you have done?
Well, I've been asked that question before.
So you must
And
have
it's
the answer.
like, I have the answer already. It's like asking a mother which is her favorite
Yes.
child. You know, you like one for one reason, perhaps because nobody else seems to like it. You like another because everybody seems to like it. Why shouldn't you join in, you know? You like one piece because it took so much labor. You worked so hard on it over such a long time. And it took, it seemed such a difficult birth, you might say. On the other hand, some things came so easily that you feel happy about the fact that they came that easily. So you have different reasons for liking different pieces.
Thank you very much.